Coming up, the New York Football Giants gave a vote of confidence to Joe Shane and Brian Daboll, and yet there are still more questions to be answered this offseason. Who will be the play callers on either side of the ball? And has Brian Daboll been effectively neutered as the head coach? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Arbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we're wondering what comes next for the New York Football Giants, because yes, John Mara gave the vote of confidence to the GM and head coach, but also said he's feeling very impatient and this team needs to win now. Andy, how are we, sir, on a Wednesday?
Oh, Adam, just even you recapping what was said on Monday just gets my blood boiling, because it's like, and it should, because we didn't mention it on Monday's episode, but Diana Rossini, who's well connected around the league, came out and said that executives were equally as shocked that Joe Shane kept his job as Trent Baalke of the Jacksonville Jaguars was able to keep his GM position. And who would have thought the Giants, a blue blood stalwart organization, are now being compared to the dysfunction of a team like the Jacksonville Jaguars?
Yeah, but that's where we are historically, right? The last handful of years have been a lot of losing, among the most losing franchises in the NFL. Unlike the Jacksonville Jaguars, right, wrong, indifferent, where he fits in the pecking order, they have a franchise quarterback, at least on paper. And the only thing that could make this worse, I mean, thank goodness for the Jacksonville Jaguars, who, after firing their head coach, still also gave the caveat that the incoming head coach could change his mind about his current GM, who was on the call while saying, man, maybe I'll fire him. I don't know. We'll see what happens. So there's at least a little bit more dysfunction there in Jacksonville, even at this point.
Yeah, talk about a hold my beer situation. You have John Mara that's like, I trust the process, but I'm getting impatient, but we need to win now. We have a playoff mandate, but we want to develop a quarterback. You're like, what is this guy talking about? And then Shad Khan comes out and is like, the GM that's on this call, like, he could come or go depending on if we get like a really good coach. Like, it's a real fluid situation over here. It's like, who is in charge down there? Dysfunction all around the league. It is a shame that the Giants are a part of that right now.
Yeah, right on par. I think it's now to 6 coaches that have been let go this offseason. That's historically over the last like 10, 15 years. It's somewhere between 6 and 7 coaches that get let go every single season, which, by the way, is just in its own right a shocking statistic, that it's like every year you're going to see 25 to 30% of the league just, okay, see you later, wasn't good enough, whatever the case may be. And some of those first-year head coaches that have been let go has also been alarming as well. We'll actually get into that a little bit when we talk about the defensive side of the football for the New York Giants. But at the top here, one of the things, as we see here in the rundown, if you're watching over on YouTube, is who's the boss? Because, okay, John Mara gave this vote of confidence, sort of, to Joe Shane and Brian Daboll. But now immediately the questions are coming up about what's going to happen with play calling for Brian Daboll. He didn't have it the year prior, took it away from Kafka. Now he had it back, but the offense wasn't particularly productive. Are they going to make him hand off that responsibility? And if you do that, I know we can agree or disagree about whether or not the organization should have kept GM and head coach in place here. But the fact that you kept Brian Daboll in place and then are also kind of saying, we're going to strip you down here a little bit, that to me is again like that half-pregnant decision about, right? Like, we're not going to go all the way to firing you. We're going to sort of give you a vote of confidence, but we're also going to make it in a structure where seemingly, if this doesn't work out, it's all on you. You'll be the lame duck, obviously. And if it does work out, there's always going to be this caveat now about whether or not Brian Daboll actually is capable of running an organization as a head coach, as opposed to maybe being a passenger and needing to construct success around him.
That's the total correct answer, Adam, is that it's almost more dysfunctional for John Mara to be like, you sure you want to keep play calling duties? Like, are you sure? It's like, John Mara, what do you know about calling plays? Like, that's the crazy part to me. Like, either you want Brian Daboll as your leader and you give him the ability to make decisions almost autonomously about the coaching staff, or you need someone else in there. Because to your point, if it doesn't go well and Brian Daboll gave up play calling duties and they say, why didn't it go well? He's like, well, my hands were tied. Like, I wasn't able to call plays because the organization didn't want me to anymore. And then all of a sudden, John Mara's like, it wasn't good enough with Brian Daboll. And they're like, well, do you think you hindered him by telling him he couldn't call plays anymore? Either you're in and the whole thing goes, or you're out and you find someone that doesn't want to call plays, and you find an offensive coordinator that's young, up and coming, that will call plays for you. Like, to me, you're half pregnant is a great way to describe it. It's like, you want him here, but under these conditions, but will that let him thrive? Like, I don't know if it's ever, has it ever been successful when an owner just comes down and is like, I'm stripping this guy of play calling duties?
Well, and also too, it's also that, like, to give the vote of confidence, again, you can agree or disagree with keeping them, but if you chose to keep them, then you should be choosing to say, and whatever you think is the best version, continue to
Correct.
work the vision instead of caveating or handcuffing them. One last note here before we turn our attention over to Kafka and over to Bowen, two coaches that are interestingly maybe having different coordinators that are having different offseason experiences right now. But this was posted up over on X the other day. A reminder here that as the offensive coordinator in 2009 in Cleveland, 29th ranked offense under Brian Daboll. 2010 in Cleveland, 31st. 2011 in Miami, 20th. 2012 in Kansas City, 22nd. And then you flip it after the Josh Allen. This is around the Josh Allen era. Then you flip over and you get, as the head coach, 20th, 30th, and 31st. There's offenses and offensive examples in Brian's past that suggest maybe it's that classic, where are you best suited in from a role perspective, head coach or coordinator. But then even more than that, I found it really surprising to rehave the conversation of, well, who made who? Right? Like, you always talk about how successful he was in Buffalo helping Josh Allen. But okay, Josh Allen is now on an MVP run here, and they continue to have success, and he continues to be a big part of that. Was Brian Daboll, in fact, the passenger? Maybe much like Joe Shane was also the passenger as the assistant GM in Buffalo a few years ago.
It's a good call out, Adam. It reminds me of the Brady Belichick conversation where, like, all of a sudden you take Tom Brady, you put him somewhere else, and he still wins Super Bowls. And Bill Belichick, before and after Tom Brady, didn't have the same type of success that he had. It is a challenge. I will say, in Brian Daboll's defense, two things. One, you had the likes of Colt McCoy and Matt Castle and other.
Tap into it, right? You got to tap into the QBs, sure.
If you look at it, you're like, wow, they survived the whole year of being like a first string quarterback in the NFL. Like, good for them. The second thing is, clearly Brian Daboll is well regarded around the league. And I think we saw it when you look at a lot of the film and the tape. Players are getting open. Like, the scheme seems to be there in terms of like separation. Obviously, there were some untimely play calls, like that weird flea flicker, which was like the end of Daniel Jones. There were some other ones, but if players are getting separation and the big plays are there, then they are right, and they are just one player away from being able to hit on those. So this is, I mean, after this season, I think we can all agree, like, if we don't see any progression, and they've now gone to their second or third quarterback that they've decided on, like, enough is enough. We have to get Brian Daboll back into an offensive coordinator position, and maybe someone else is calling plays.
Yeah, 100%. So coming up here in a second, what about the offensive and defensive coordinator positions? Shane Bowen has been the ire of a lot of Giants fans' eyes, but certainly of Andy's for the last handful of weeks of this season. But Mike Kafka has basically been the ghost. What is up with him getting some head coaching interview buzz as this offseason for some teams, for many teams, for the non-playoff teams, is underway? We'll do that here coming up next. Okay, so we turn our attention now to the coordinator roles. And again, this is another interesting spot, I think. And we're going to talk about a couple of these candidates that could be brought in the door here, some familiar names that are being thrown out now that are having success right now for playoff teams. But let's just start with, let's start offensive, just because this is, I think, surprising to most, that Mike Kafka, who, and by the way, that first year for Brian Daboll as head coach, 20th ranked offense, well, you had somebody in there at the time who was play calling for you, and now that's gone the other direction. Are you surprised that Mike Kafka is getting head coaching job interviews in this early phase of the playoff run, where it may take you a few more weeks to get your hands on some of those higher ranking names?
Well, the question is, did the season make Mike Kafka look better, right? Like, the Giants went to the playoffs with Mike Kafka calling plays with Daniel Jones a few years ago. And then obviously there was a tough season last year, and Brian Daboll kind of took over play calling duties. Then all of a sudden this year, Mike Kafka's like, okay, I'll just work with some of the position players. Brian, this is your show. And we see that now the Giants have the third overall pick. and it's got progressively worse since
Yeah.
Daboll has taken over. Now, you can put that on the quarterback, you can put that on players getting injured, whatever you want, but teams around the league may turn around and say, that guy calling plays got Daniel Jones to the playoffs and winning playoff games. And then you look at it and say, well, he clearly hasn't lost his ability to coach. He's been up for numerous other positions. He wanted to go interview as the offensive coordinator for Seattle last year. That got blocked. Now you're hearing the Bears and the Saints and other teams that need a head coach are thinking offensive minded. And maybe they're looking back and saying, maybe things were the best under Mike Kafka for the New York Football Giants.
Well, this is that classic, you go back to Kansas City and Mike Kafka being there and what the opportunity was and getting the buzz around his name, which is how he became the offensive coordinator for the Giants. And at a high level, I just think it's the league looking and saying, I'm not going to trust the eye test on what I see happening in New York for my evaluation of coordinators or of potential coaches, right? And I think, it's one of those things that you almost want the multiverse here where what if Brian Daboll had been fired? What would teams around the league be doing with their openings, maybe for offensive coordinator roles or even head coaching roles? If you're willing to interview Mike Kafka, you would think, even coming off of being fired, that Brian Daboll might actually be on a few teams' short list for the position somewhere else. So that's what I have to assume is you look at the pedigree and coming out underneath Andy Reid and feeling like, yes, maybe there's this young mind here. I'm going to tell you, I'll be shocked if Mike Kafka gets a head coaching job. That would shock me to no end. Now, a lateral move and getting back into real play calling duties somewhere, I think that's what his goal is here, right? How do I get back to that spot? And the unfortunate thing when it comes to Kafka, and I'm curious about your take on it, is the Giants can't do that now. You cannot go back to giving play calling back to Mike Kafka after stripping it away from him. Like, I don't think you can, right? Or if they did that, let me rephrase. If the Giants turn around and come out and say that Brian Daboll is giving offensive play calling back to Mike Kafka, even if it would make the team better, you would have to throw your hands up in the air and say, like, what are we doing here? Because now we're like half undoing what we did over the last couple of seasons. I mean, I would be angst ridden if Mike Kafka is still here as the offensive coordinator and the Giants are talking about him running the ship on that side of the ball.
It would actually be a rudderless ship at that point. You're like, how are you taking play call and giving it back? It's this quarterback's fault. It's this. We didn't get enough of it's like, well, you guys got to figure this out. Like at some point, you can't. There's no more pointing fingers. Adam, the way that I look at this is very simple. Giant fans should be over the moon that Mike Kafka is getting these interviews for head coaching positions. He falls under a minority candidate for, I believe, one of his parents is Puerto Rican. It falls under the Rooney Rule, which means that if any other team hires Mike Kafka, the New York Giants get a third-round draft pick in the upcoming NFL draft and an additional third-round draft pick in the following draft. So the Giants will get 2 third-round picks. One, I think that would be a home run for the Giants to be able to let Mike Kafka go somewhere else, get a head coaching job, and get draft capital for it. But the other thing is, if he doesn't get any of these head coaching positions and you aren't going to give him back play calling duties, don't you think it's about time to say, if you want to look elsewhere for OC positions where you can call plays or do have an opportunity to become a head coach? Like Seattle wanted it last year. They hired their second or third choice. He already got fired. Like it makes all the sense in the world. They've wanted him multiple times. If the Giants don't want him for that skill set, it feels like at some point, maybe we should bring in someone else, especially if you're thinking about giving up play calling duties in your Brian Daboll.
If you are, and I agree with you. Yes. I mean, like, listen, come on, everybody move on a little bit here. I mean, that's what we were hoping for kind of this offseason when it came to the GM and head coach. Everybody, let's just move on. We'll all be better for it. We'll all go have success. We wish you nothing but the best. We just can't try to do it again here. When we think then about, let's assume that Mike Kafka, one way or the other, is gone from the New York Giants. And again, I cannot reiterate, nobody is giving up 2 third-round picks to get him as their head coach.
They don't have to give up the third-round picks.
Giants compensatory.
The NFL just gives them that as compensatory. So
the Giants are not going to.
Part. Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine trying to convince a team. Why don't you give us some picks? Head coach. But I do like Seattle maybe for Kafka. Hey, like you tried it. Grubb came in, one and done. He's out. And by the way, just as a quick side note, he's now getting mentioned as, if Kafka's gone, maybe he would be a candidate to be brought in for the Giants to take over on the offensive side. And again, for a guy who was there in Washington in the college ranks there, with the Huskies, like you go back to college, you can see some of the track record. His only track record here at the NFL level is what he just did, which was going to Seattle and have Seattle be like, "Ugh, I do not love what we just did. You can go ahead and hit the bricks." He has a long track record. There's plenty of things to look at. I find it comical, right? When you go, "Hey, one and done as an OC, you're our guy. Come on over to Big Blue."
The funny thing is, I believe his offense was ranked 20th in the NFL this year, which is what Mike Kafka's best offense was for the Giants
Well, let's get it
back in
right.
the
Let's
day.
go
So
right back to
it
2022
is
rise to
fascinating.
bring in this
And
coach that can do
so
it.
when we talk about, okay, let's just say for argument's sake, the Giants decide that they're either moving on from Mike Kafka or Mike Kafka gets a head coaching position.
Yeah.
Either one of the two. I mean, how do you think the one name that comes to mind for me is the quarterbacks coach Davis Webb is a name that's being talked around circles. He's the quarterbacks coach for the Denver Broncos.
Yep.
They
Done a
credit
nice job with
him
Nick.
with a lot of the progression of Bo Nix. He's
Yep.
already getting an interview with the Saints for their head coaching position. He seems like a very simple, has familiarity with the coaching staff. Coaching staff wanted to keep him as like a half player coach to begin with. And now he's an up and comer, still only 29. How would you feel if the Giants said, let's go younger, let's go with a guy like Davis Webb, who's at least shown that he can, mentor a quarterback like Bo Nix?
Yeah, and I mean, they have Shane Tierney in house as well, and that's been talked about a little bit. Would you just promote him? He's well regarded, at least inside the building. I don't know if we feel like the sample size we've gotten from the Giants quarterbacks, instill confidence to whatever degree. The thing with Davis Webb is like this falls into the category of, hey, I think he is doing great. And it's awesome what he's doing with Bo Nix, right? You want to help, you want to put a little bit of that right in his corner when it comes to Sean Payton and developing that young quarterback. Okay, great. But the Giants let him leave. You had him in as the player coach. You knew him from Buffalo. You knew him in New York. If you wanted to have that track continue, why not just keep him around, right? Instead, and this is maybe just more judgmental again about the Kafka stuff. It's like you don't just fire Kafka. You mess around. You switch it up. You demote him. You take away play calling. You could have done this a year ago. We could have been talking about this past season, whether it was Shane Tierney or somebody else as the offensive coordinator, and then Davis Webb sitting there as the QB coach and working with your young quarterbacks, even though you don't have your franchise guy yet. So part of me feels like Davis Webb, it's probably the journey has taken him away. And then the other side of it would be if you are the Giants and you're John Mara and you said, hey, my patience is thin and I expect playoffs. If you're Joe Shane and Brian Daboll, are you going to hand over the offensive coordinator role, play calling duties to a first-year offensive coordinator who just spent his first year as the QB coach with a successful young product? But that is a lot. He may be good. Like he may go on to be a very good coach, but that is a lot to put onto the plate of Davis Webb and say, you're kind of the critical function here that needs to help us all save our jobs.
Dan Duggan came out and said of all the players that he's ever covered, he said Davis Webb was the first one that he was absolutely 100% convinced without any question would be an NFL coach. Like he was like, that guy is 100%, which is great. I also think for the Giants, organization-wise, it would be a great move because we're getting younger. He's an up-and-comer.
Sure.
And if, honestly, things don't work out with Brian Daboll and Joe Shane, like I don't think they will, you have a 29-year-old up-and-coming offensive-minded offensive coordinator that you could very easily turn to the fan base and say, we're looking to the future. We're getting young and innovative. And if Daboll leaves even halfway through the season, at least we have a guy that could take over. So for me, I'm just thinking I'm covering all my bases because I already hate the fact that we're keeping consistency in this tire fire of last season.
And that's the real question here too, right? Davis Webb, is he a young, innovative mind on the offensive side of the football? Is he very sound in helping to develop quarterbacks? And we've seen this before. Backup quarterbacks tend to be really good at helping to develop young quarterbacks, even when they're still in their playing careers, because they're there watching all the time, right? They're always studying the film. So you have that extra set of eyes. And I'll just throw in the mix here before we flip over to the defensive side of the football. And ironically, a name that I thought, and I did even said over on X, I thought would be one to bring home to Big Blue, but I'm kind of backing off of that a little bit now. It's just noteworthy that it's also been mentioned if Kafka is no longer with the Giants by the time this offseason unfolds, whether it's Shea Tierney. Also, you go look at Minnesota and Josh McCown, who spent time in New York as well. They kept him there as a bit of a player coach when they had Zach Wilson. Now he's there in Minnesota. They've been having success. So I wonder if the Giants maybe we can start to think about if drafting a young quarterback, if that's the way they're going to go this offseason, are they trying to put themselves in a good position to feel like their OC is going to be as valuable to that quarterback's development as possible. Here in a second, though. Here in a second. And he can let me know how excited he'd be about Josh McCown if he wants, but also other firings around the league included former New York Football Giants linebacker Antonio Pierce, who was let go by the Vegas Raiders. And of course, the immediate from both the fan base, from the media coverage, from Andy, from everybody was bring him home. Let's bring back that big blue mentality on that side of the ball, jettisoning one Shane Bowen in the process. We'll find out if Andy believes that's the right path in just one moment. All right, as we continue today's OGP, talking about the offseason and how critical it is. Okay, you decided to stick with Joe Shane and with Brian Daboll. Awesome, or whatever. But who is going to help this coaching staff progress? One hierarching thing here for me that I wanted to ask you too was, how concerned are you about who gets hired in this offseason relative to the potential that Brian Daboll doesn't end up being the head coach beyond this season, that Joe Shane isn't the GM beyond this season, and you're bringing in guys that you may like, but are going to be hard to keep coming out of what could be another rough season?
Well, it's the domino effect, Adam. It's like if John Mara gave Joe Shane the I believe in you, you are here for next season, but like let's see what we could do around Brian Daboll and others. Like they looked around the league. That was I know that you were spot on that, saying, okay, they looked around the league once they did that, and no good head coach wanted to come to the Giants if that was the case.
Who wants to be here?
Just take it another level a little bit deeper. It's like, okay, well, if you know that the GM and the head coach are both on shaky ground, what type of coordinator is going to be the one that's willing to take this job, knowing that it could be a 1 year, 6 month, 9 month thing? Like, who even knows how long people are going to be around for? That is the difficult piece of this, is like, who is the quality person that wants to take this job when there's a whole host of other jobs open around the league right now?
Yeah, that's my concern here. So, you know, obviously a conversation for another day, or when it comes to these coordinators, we will get the same kind of sense, right? What head coach was going to want to come to take this job? Well, what coordinators that are looking to take the next step in their career, and probably look at Mike Kafka, by the way, and go, is that really my next journey? To go from Kansas City and Andy Reid and being a key cog and winning championships and being well regarded, to being flogged and stripped of my responsibilities and potentially being treated as a scapegoat on my way out the door. That's a hard sell. Defensively here, though, we talk about Shane Bowen. It just feels like Kafka's taking interviews. I don't know what's going to happen with him if he doesn't get another job somewhere else. The Giants will just outright fire him. Shane Bowen does seem destined to be one and done here for a whole host of reasons that we've talked about recently. When you hear Antonio Pierce, what was your just initial? Antonio Pierce is let go from Vegas. Do you go, boom, talk to me about New York Football Giants' new defensive coordinator?
I do not. I mean, I like Antonio Pierce.
Okay, great. Because I did for a brief second, and then I did the quick, because I wasn't sure, but I was pretty positive that his coaching history is relatively short. So I did the quick mental catalog of that, and I was like, why am I automatically getting overexcited about a college linebacker coach that then elevated to linebacker coach with the Raiders and then got the interim head coaching job, and there we go. Like he leapt over a couple of steps in the process. Why am I assuming that he is the key contributor to the year prior when that defense was pretty good and did play, over their value maybe, but he wasn't the defensive coordinator. He was the linebackers coach. I've been a little surprised how elevated some people have made his profile.
Yeah, I agree with you. You know what it is? We are conflating the feel-good moments that we had with Antonio Pierce in a New York Giants football uniform as a player, and we're conflating that with having a lot of coaching success or being prepared to be the coordinator. Now, listen, you may say, well, Andy, he was a head coach. Like, he could very easily be a coordinator. Can he? I don't know. He's never been a defensive coordinator before. So don't you feel like it's a little bit difficult to turn around and say that he would absolutely be a home run? For me, I mean, we talked about it briefly on the last episode. There's a ton of defensive coordinator candidates that are out on the market right now that I would probably prioritize over Antonio Pierce, as much as I would love to see him come back maybe he comes back in the linebacker role for the New York Giants. Like, I would love that, but there's 2 or 3. I mean, how do you feel about what you want from the coordinator position?
No, I agree with you on Pearson. Just as a matter of fact, he was promoted at Arizona State to co-defensive coordinator there before he moved on to the NFL. But as we know, you
Is
tend
that
to
assistant to the regional manager, or is it the assistant regional
yeah,
manager?
exactly. There with Marvin Lewis. It's on your business card, but let's just be clear, you're not in charge. And I don't mean to belittle it because that is a part of the process for any coach. I think that the unfortunate thing for Antonio Pierce is, again, when you start to all of a sudden ramp up, and going to the Vegas Raiders maybe is a hard landing spot for a coach as well. All of a sudden you get thrust into the head coaching role. It doesn't pan out. No real great quarterback play. All the things we always talk about with the Giants sometimes. Now there's a bit of a stink, I think, attached to you. And you know, what felt like this very rapid journey to a head coaching role, he may have to take 4 steps back to start to take another step forward in his career. I personally, this one I think is one that you're going to agree with as well. Although I know you made mention of Cincinnati and their recently fired coordinator, Gerard Mayo. I mean, Gerard Mayo, for everything that seemingly went wrong in New England, not necessarily his responsibility or not, here's a prime example to me of, well, this guy knows defense. He may not know how to run a team as a head coach. He may not be the guy you want at the helm when all of a sudden you hear Mike Vrabel's on the market and available and you want to bring him in. But I think that Gerard Mayo should be one of those top candidates that you look at if you're the Giants. And unlike maybe the offensive side, which has some ambiguity, I know you have some weapons, but there's no quarterback, right? We don't know. If you're a DC, prospective DC, you look at the Giants, like, you can see a lot of weapons and talent on the defensive side of the football and probably say, oh, my system makes this defense strong, unlike the way maybe things feel on the offensive side.
Yeah, and obviously the New England ties are strong there with Gerard Mayo.
Of course.
Obviously, Brian Daboll was there for a while, Joe Shane. Like, there is this connection of different players all around. Gerard Mayo, he only had 4 years of being out of the league before he became the linebackers coach, and was there for a handful of seasons, and then was picked as the successor to Bill Belichick out of nowhere. It was
Yeah.
very surprising to me. I think he would be a great hire. I agree with you on the defensive side. Lou Anarumo is my number one guy from Cincinnati. I know they had like the worst defense in the league this year. I peg that more on them just losing talent. They let safety after safety after safety that was really good go year after year, and they sat there and were like, I wonder why we're just getting thrown all over in the back of our secondary. To me,
Yep.
I think he would be a wonderful hire. As we mentioned before, worked for the Giants, has already been in the building, has familiarity with the organization. To me, he'd be a home run hire. The whole thing about Shane Bowen is this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. They brought him in saying that no matter what, he is stout defensively against the run. That's what he hangs his hat on. They even mentioned it in Hard Knocks. And then we went and we were bottom 5 in the league in rushing yards against per game.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can't have that as your calling card, and then your calling card doesn't deliver when we need it the most. And do I think Shane Bowen is the number one reason why we struggled this year? Absolutely not. But I do think that the defense regressed, players on the defense regressed, like Bobby Okereke and others, and we just need a new voice in here. They tried something. He wasn't even there. Bobby Babich of Buffalo was obviously their first choice. Didn't get him. I think it's time to move on from the Shane Bowen experience.
Yeah, and the one and done nature of it, right? Once again, like, this is that, like, the classic, like, are you overlapping coordinators in a bad way? They didn't get their, by the way, they didn't get their number one choice last year when they're talking about DCs. One that I'll use an example here, as there's been some rumblings in Denver as they head into the playoffs, that we could be talking about Vance Joseph heading out the door there. So there's already been speculating about who would you bring in to replace him. And I'll use this just for any team, including the Giants, obviously. Not only do you have potentially someone like Antonio Pierce, who's going to at least get interviews, I would assume. I don't know how it lands. Maybe Mayo is the guy who, if you just look back to his defensive value as a coach, that's something you can really like. We've mentioned Robert Saleh before on this podcast. The funny thing is, I actually think it matters to certain coaches. Like, Saleh probably wants to get himself into a really good spot where, like, he just gets to be a really great defensive coordinator, and also gets associated with winning football, not just being good on his side, actually being with a winning program again. So I think some coaches are going to make hard choices about that. The other interesting one to me, just to throw out, is Dennis Allen as well. Like, that's another one where, the Saints, they've had good defensive units in recent years. So unlike maybe the offensive coordinator role, which I think is probably going to be beholden to who wants to take it and whether or not the Giants can get their hands on him, I think defensively, like, there's going to be some really good options here for the Giants. And that's why, maybe unlike Kafka and whatever's going on with the offensive side of the ball, I think it behooves the Giants to make the decision as soon as possible with Shane Bowen and start talking to these coordinators. Like, start putting out feelers. And a guy like Robert Saleh, who's unemployed right now, you can go talk to him right now. Like, just go and have the conversation. Find out whether or not you might be interested. Same thing with Mayo, right? Like, just go have the conversations immediately and find out whether or not, because maybe you get to put an offer on the table before another team, before a better situation comes calling, something that I think the Giants should definitely be considering.
Yeah, and Adam, when we talk about at the end of the day on the offseason impact of all this, I believe that the defensive coordinator position of the Giants is a highly coveted position, especially given the circumstances, because of twofold. One, Brian Daboll is an offensive-minded coach. He's going to say, "You get full
Do your
autonomy on
job.
defense. Go handle your business. I've got bigger fish to fry with, like, who my coordinator is, who's calling plays, who my quarterbacks are going to be. I need
When
a
am I
whole new
getting
quarter.
fired? It's just so many
I
things
might
I have
just
to
get let
focus on.
go. I don't know." And then secondly, like, depending on who's there as the OC, if things go wrong with Brian Daboll, if you're a defensive-minded coach that's doing well, you're immediately going to get promoted to be the interim head coach. So, like, there is that possibility of, like, if the offense struggles, they're not going to be like, let's promote the offensive coordinator who's clearly not helping Brian Daboll at all. It'll be a veteran like a Mayo, a Pierce, an Anarumo, a Sala, like, to be able to just give stability to the organization. So for me, I think there's plenty of people that would be interested in the defensive coordinator position job. But for what you pointed out on offense, it's going to be tough for the Giants to figure out what that room is going to look like.
We still have to tap back into the fact that Joe Shane came out and kind of basically said, they're still not that far away, which is just absolutely mind numbing. And we'll see how that plays itself out this offseason with big decisions to make. One other thing that we have to talk about too, I think there's a couple of players we'll talk about probably next week that I have a couple of guys on this roster that I think would be shocking trade candidates for the Giants to help restructure this team, maybe in a better direction where they can be balanced on both sides of the football. And then the other thing that I think we'll have to talk about at some point is how concerning is it that for a large stretch of either this season from last season, there was an overlap for sure that Brian Daboll was dyeing his beard. There's real issue and concern there that over the course of a single NFL season, you could see a guy go from jet black beard to then kind of some natural gray, like Andrew Makowitz is proudly displaying when he comes on the podcast every single day. Insecurity is not something that you can have at the highest possible position of your organization. So that may be a red flag enough. Could have been a big reason that John Mara could have brought to the table. We need you to give up play calling duties, and we need you to take this seriously and stop dyeing your hair.
What other podcast will have you answer the hard-hitting questions about Brian Daboll dyeing his beard? You can also say dieting for Brian Daboll. He definitely looked a little slimmer and slender. Did he lose a step because he was too much pep in his step? I don't know, Adam. These are the questions that are going to unfold this whole offseason.
Sometimes when you're moving too fast, you just need to slow down. Bottom line is, guys, coming up on Friday, we're going to take a look at quarterbacks that are playing this weekend. Who should you keep an eye on? Because guess what? The Giants need quarterbacks. I'll even ask Andy if he thinks that there's a real chance that Drew Lock will be the guy under center next year for the Giants. Come on, baby. Let's run it back one more time. You get us over on YouTube at One Giant Podcast. You get us over on X at One Giant Podcast, on your podcast feeds at One Giant Podcast, and also at AMAC214 and at Adam Armbrecht. Until the next time, until the best times. As Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.